She was 13 when the old man came for her. Not with gifts, not with words, but with a rope and a ring. They said the wedding took place behind the cabin, where the soil never grew anything but weeds and bones. The air that morning was heavy, the kind that doesn't move, the kind that listens. Chickens stopped their pecking. Dogs hid under porches. Even the wind refused to cross that patch of earth. The girl stood barefoot, her dress made from torn flour sacks, her hair brushed just enough to make her look like something that once belonged to God. Her grandfather, her husband, to be, stood across from her, a man whose hands had buried 3 wives and raised none. His face was a map of the mountains, cut deep with age, and his eyes glimmered like wet coal. When he took her hand, his fingers swallowed hers, bones pressing against bones. The few who watched said nothing. They were kin, cousins, uncles, half-brothers. Their faces twisted in the same quiet deformities, the same sagging lips and wandering eyes. They'd seen this before. They knew what was being done, and yet they stayed silent, because in those mountains, silence was not fear. It was custom. When the preacher spoke, his voice trembled, not from pity but from the knowing. He had buried enough children in those hills to understand what kind of sin was being sealed that day. But he said the words anyway. He tied the knot. He closed the Bible. And when the ceremony ended, no one clapped. The only sound that followed was the low moan of the wind through the valley. Like the mountain itself was grieving. That night, the girl didn't cry. She didn't know she was supposed to. In her small world, obedience was survival. The bed creaked under the weight of their bloodline, folding back in on itself, generation after generation collapsing like rotted beams. Outside, a lone owl called once, and then went silent, as if it too could not bear to witness what was happening inside that cabin. By morning, the forest seemed older. The house smelled of sweat and iron. The old man came out first, lighting his pipe with hands that didn't shake. Behind him, she appeared, small, pale, her eyes distant, her body moving like something broken. Her childhood had ended before the sun rose. "Tell me, which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now, where you are?" There are parts of the Appalachian Mountains where maps fade into nothing, where roads end not with signs, but with silence. If you drive far enough into those woods, you'll find places where time no longer moves forward. It only folds back, over and over, like pages in a forgotten book. That's where she lived. That's where the story of the girl and her grandfather began and ended, all within the same hollow breath of the mountains. The year was never properly recorded. Some say it was the late 1940s, others swear it was much later. Deep into the 1960s, when men were walking on the moon, and yet here, in the Appalachian Hollers, people still lit lamps with kerosene and gave birth in the dark. The nearest town was a half day's walk down a dirt trail so narrow that even the sheriff's car refused to go that far. Families there didn't have surnames. They had nicknames passed down like curses: the bent eyes, the crooked jaws, the hollow bones. You could tell which ridge someone came from by the way their face leaned, by the slope of their shoulders, by the drawl that turned their words into murmurs. Old records tell little. Church books end abruptly after a certain year. Census takers stopped coming when one of them disappeared. Swallowed by the woods, they said. Others whispered he didn't vanish at all, that he was invited to stay for supper and never left because he had seen too much. Generations before her, the same bloodline had already begun to decay. Brothers married sisters, cousins shared children, and fathers buried sons who looked too much like themselves. It was not love, it was survival. The mountains cut them off from the world, and what happens to a people left too long alone is not madness. It's evolution turned cruel. The girl was born into that silence, one more branch of a tree that had long stopped reaching for the sun. Her mother had died young, her body torn apart during childbirth, and no one spoke of who the father was. The old man took her in then, raised her as his own until the day he decided she would be more than that. No one questioned him. No one dared. He was the last of the men who remembered the old ways, when families didn't need law or church to tell them what was right. The mountains had their own rules. Rules written in isolation, rules that demanded loyalty to blood above all else. When outsiders spoke of Appalachia, they talked about poverty, coal, and moonshine. They didn't talk about the things whispered in the woods. They didn't talk about families who never left, about children who called their grandfathers Daddy, about the smell of rot that came not from the earth, but from blood itself. And beneath it all, deep in that hollow, the girl's story grew darker. Because once you marry the man who raised you, the line between protection and possession disappears. The hollow was called Blackroot. Though on no official map would you ever find that name, it existed like a scar between two ridges, a place where light never lingered. The soil there was darker than it should have been, heavy with the bones of those who had died without graves. Every few years, when the floods came, the water would rise and carry bits of old life downstream. Teeth, a child's shoe, a photograph half rotted through. People in the nearest town pretended not to notice. They said the mountain keeps what belongs to it. Her cabin stood near the center of that place, built from wood so old it wept sap even in winter. The porch sagged. The roof bowed. Every creak sounded like a prayer for mercy. Chickens scratched in the dirt outside, and in the distance, the forest watched. Not moving, not breathing, only waiting. She was barely more than a child, and yet already her eyes carried the dull weight of someone who had seen too much. Her grandfather called her his little wife, with a voice that rasped like gravel. He would sit in the doorway at dusk, pipe smoke curling around his head, and watch her move about the cabin. She cooked what little they had, mended torn shirts, and obeyed every word without question. There were no schools in Blackroot, no church bells, no laughter. Only the low drone of cicadas, and the sound of something crawling beneath the floorboards at night. No one ever came to visit, except once every few months, when a man from the next ridge would trade cornmeal for salt or tobacco. He never stayed long. He said the air there felt wrong, as if it carried voices that didn't belong to the living. Others refused to go altogether, warning that the family in Blackroot was not right in the head. When she walked outside, the wind seemed to hush. The birds went quiet. Even the dogs kept their distance. Her body was changing too soon, a strange blending of youth and womanhood. Her face had that familiar look that ran through her bloodline, the eyes too close together, the jaw that never sat right, the slight tilt of the head that gave her the appearance of always listening to something far away. There are stories from the Holler, quiet, uncertain stories, of what happened in that cabin after the marriage. Neighbors said they could hear her singing at night, soft and low, the kind of song a mother hums to her child. But there was no child, only her voice drifting through the trees, fading into silence. Some said it wasn't singing at all. It was crying, the sound twisted by distance until it became something unrecognizable. And still, No one intervened. In Blackroot, sin wasn't punished, it was inherited. Every generation paid for the one before. It happened in winter, the kind of winter the mountains remember. Snow fell thick and wet, sealing every cabin beneath a white hush. Smoke rose from chimneys like the breath of ghosts. Somewhere in the stillness, in that sagging cabin in Blackroot, the girl screamed. No one came. No midwife, no doctor, not even a neighbor. Only the old man, her husband, her grandfather, pacing outside while she bled into the mattress, her body too small, too frail to carry what he had forced inside her. They say she was barely 14. By morning, the crying stopped. Not hers, but the child's. For 3 nights, a single candle burned in the window. Then the light went out, and when it did, the people on the ridge knew what that meant. The child had not lived. When spring came, and the snow melted back into the earth, the girl began walking the woods alone. She'd vanish at dawn and return at dusk, her bare feet black with soil, her hands covered in scratches. Some said she was digging. Others said she was talking, not to herself, but to something buried. The old man grew meaner. His voice turned sharp, his eyes distant. He accused her of witchcraft, of bringing sickness into the house. The hens stopped laying. The cows birthed calves with twisted legs. Once, a traveler passing through saw her by the creek, holding a bundle wrapped in cloth, singing that same broken song she had sung before. When he asked what she carried, she told him, "He's sleeping now." He said her smile was too calm to belong to the living. After that day, no one saw the bundle again. But the ground behind the cabin, the same ground where they'd been married, was disturbed. The dirt turned over in the shape of something small. That summer, people began hearing things. Strange sounds carried down from the holler, soft weeping, then laughter, then silence again. Hunters claimed to see her wandering with her hair undone, eyes blackened, whispering names that no one recognized. Children who strayed too close to the woods swore they heard a baby crying, even though no babies lived in Blackroot anymore. Her husband did not speak of it. He sat on the porch at dusk, pipe gone cold, staring at the woods like he was waiting for something to step out. Some nights, the candle returned to the window, flickering faintly through the dark. Always just one, always burning until dawn. And those who looked long enough swore they could see 2 shadows moving behind the curtain. One tall, one small. By the time the next winter came, something in that holler had changed. The snow no longer looked white when it fell there. It came down gray, gathering the smell of smoke and rot. Hunters began avoiding the ridge altogether, saying the deer wouldn't go near the creek anymore, that the water had turned the color of rust. The girl, now a woman in name only, had grown quiet. Too quiet. Her voice, when it came, was soft and strange, like she was listening to someone who wasn't there, and repeating what they said. The old man had stopped going to town. People said his eyes looked different now, milky, clouded, like something inside him had died. When travelers did pass through, a rare thing, they noticed carvings on the cabin door, circles, crosses, marks made by hands that didn't seem steady. One man, a peddler, knocked once and swore he heard whispering before anyone answered. He left the next morning before sunrise and was later found miles away, wandering the road barefoot, muttering that the woods were breathing. Those who lived near enough to hear what went on in Blackroot said the girl began singing again. Not the sad lullabies from before, but something lower, rhythmic, like a chant. The sound came most nights just before the wind picked up, just before the dogs started howling. The animals in the holler began to die. First the hens, then the goats. Their bodies were found half buried, their bones arranged in patterns too deliberate to be the work of any beast. Someone said they saw her carrying a jar of cloudy water into the woods. Someone else swore they heard the old man screaming her name in the middle of the night. Not in anger this time, but in fear. And then the sickness came. Not a fever, not a plague, but something that spread through the family's blood. The old man's hands curled in on themselves. His jaw locked. His body shook until he couldn't stand. He'd lie on the bed with his eyes wide open, whispering to the shadows near the wall. They say she never tried to help him. She just watched. Watched as the man who had stolen her childhood now twisted under the same curse that had taken everything from her. When he finally stopped breathing, she didn't bury him. She left him where he lay, and for days afterward, smoke rose from the chimney, but no one ever saw her fetch wood. Weeks later, when a distant cousin came to check, he found the house empty, the bed blackened, the walls marked with those same symbols, and in the ashes near the hearth, something small, something bone, colored, shaped like a child's hand. No one went back after that. The holler was left to itself, its name spoken only in warnings. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was waiting. It took decades before anyone dared to return to Blackroot. By then, the story had become legend, a whispered warning told by parents to children who wandered too close to the tree line. They said the place was cursed, that no crops grew where she had lived, that animals still avoided the soil. But curses do not begin as magic. They begin as blood. An old genealogist from Kentucky came searching in the late 1970s. Driven by curiosity more than belief, he had read a line in a half-burned census record. Household of 4. All of same surname, one female wife aged 13. It was the only entry for that holler. No births, no deaths. Just that one note, and a mark that looked like someone's hand had trembled before the ink dried. He followed the trail up through the ridges, guided by rumors and forgotten graves. By the time he reached what was left of Blackroot, the cabins had caved in. Trees grew through their floors. The wind sounded like breathing when it passed through the holes in the walls. In one corner of the house, he found what he thought was a cradle, carved from a hollowed log, lined with something that looked like dried moss. But when he touched it, it crumbled into dust, revealing small bones curled together like the petals of a dead flower. He took nothing from the house, but he wrote everything down. And that's when the truth began to surface. Records from nearby towns hinted at the same surname repeating for over a century. Marriages between cousins, births with no listed fathers, deaths before the age of 20. The lines on the family tree folded inward until they formed a loop. At the center of that loop was her, the girl who became her own grandmother's shadow. The genealogist traced the bloodline back as far as he could, and what he found was worse than rumor. The man who had married her had himself been the child of a union between a father and his daughter. Her mother had been his half-sister, which meant the girl, born of both, had inherited the same blood from every side. She was not merely the product of inbreeding. She was the point where an entire lineage collapsed into itself. Flesh consuming flesh, generation by generation, until identity disappeared completely. The deformities that marked her face were not accidents of nature. They were the physical map of a family that had turned in on itself for so long that its blood forgot how to make something new. And her marriage, that unspeakable bond, was not a new sin. It was the final echo of an old one. He left Blackroot before nightfall, but he said he could still hear something following him down the trail. A sound like a lullaby hummed through teeth that didn't quite fit together. When the truth began to reach the nearby towns, carried by whispers, by old church records, by the genealogist's trembling hand, the people reacted not with pity, but with fear. There are things a community can ignore for generations, and then there are things so rotten that even silence can no longer hold them. The sheriff's men went up once. After the report spread, they found the cabin exactly as the genealogist described, half eaten by moss. The roof caved in like a rib cage. Inside, the air stank of damp earth and something sweeter, something like decay. They didn't stay long. One of them swore he saw a figure in the trees, small, white-eyed, watching from behind the rot of an old oak. Another man said he heard breathing inside the empty chimney, soft and human. When they came down the ridge, they refused to speak of what they'd seen. The sheriff burned the report before it could be filed. Not long after, the townsfolk began tearing through their own records. They burned marriage ledgers, destroyed family Bibles, ripped pages from courthouse archives that mentioned certain surnames. It was not guilt that moved them. It was terror. Because once you trace a lineage back far enough in those mountains, the roots begin to intertwine, and no one wanted to discover that the sickness of Blackroot might also run through their veins. The old church at the edge of town held a sermon that winter. The preacher's hands shook as he spoke. He said the devil does not come in red skin and horns. He comes in silence. In families that close their doors too long. In fathers who believe blood is a holy thing that should never mix. He warned them to stay away from the holler, to let the mountain keep what it claimed. And then, after the sermon ended, he nailed the church doors shut. Some of the men who had been part of that family line fled. Others drank themselves blind. But the ones who stayed spoke of strange things. Of dreams where the girl appeared in the doorway of their homes. Her dress torn, her hands reaching out like a child, asking to be led back inside. And then came the fire. No one confessed to starting it. It began in the woods just below the ridge, spreading fast through the dry brush until the night itself glowed red. The flames reached what was left of the cabin, devouring the blackened timbers, the earth beneath them hissing and cracking. By dawn, the holler was nothing but ash. The people in town thought it was over then, that the mountain had finally cleansed itself. But when the wind shifted, they swore they could still smell it, not smoke, not wood, but burning flesh. And from the ashes of Blackroot, the air carried something else, a lullaby. Years passed, and the story sank beneath time, like everything else in those mountains does. Blackroot became nothing more than a ghost story, a cautionary tale told beside campfires, a warning whispered to children who stayed out too late. But blood doesn't vanish. It waits. In 1994, a woman named Eleanor Cates bought a piece of cheap land at the base of the ridge. She was a nurse, recently widowed, looking for solitude. The property listing didn't mention the holler's history, only that the soil was poor and the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. She built a small home there, quiet and neat, and for a while it seemed peaceful. Until she began digging. She'd wanted to make a garden, tomatoes, herbs, something to fill her days. But the soil was thick, clay-like, and under it she found bones. At first she thought they were animal, deer maybe, but then she found a child's skull, the teeth too small and too perfect. She called the sheriff, but he brushed it off. told her the land was full of old burials from settlers, nothing to worry about. But Eleanor couldn't sleep after that. Each night, she heard tapping, soft, rhythmic, coming from beneath the floorboards. Sometimes she woke to find dirt scattered across her kitchen tiles. Once, she found muddy footprints leading from the back door to her bed. They were small, like a child's, but too deep, as if pressed by something heavy. The nights grew longer, colder, and then the dreams began. She dreamt of a girl standing in the doorway of a burned cabin, her hair hanging wet across her face, her hands grey with ash. The girl never spoke. She just pointed toward the ground. When Eleanor woke, she'd find her fingernails caked with soil. Her hands blistered as though she'd been digging again in her sleep. One morning, she found something outside the house. A jar buried halfway in the mud. Inside was cloudy water and a single lock of hair. Beneath it, something pale, a finger bone. She took it to town, but no one would touch it. One old man at the diner looked at her and whispered, "You found her offering." Eleanor left that night, packed what she could, drove until the road disappeared behind her. The property still stands empty. The grass grows high around the porch. The windows are broken, the door half hanging. And sometimes, hikers say they see light flickering inside, like a candle burning low. Locals don't go near it. They say the girl of Blackroot was never buried, never freed. Her bloodline ended, yes, but her voice didn't. It waits for anyone foolish enough to disturb her soil. And when the wind blows through that ridge, the trees bend, not away from the house, but toward it. In the spring of 2008, a DNA study was conducted by a small Appalachian university, part of a project tracing genetic anomalies among isolated mountain communities. They collected samples from dozens of families scattered through the region, their goal simple: to map how migration, isolation, and ancestry shaped the modern gene pool. But one sample came back wrong. It belonged to a young woman from a nearby town, a student who volunteered, thinking little of it. Her name was Mary Calhoun, healthy, quiet, born and raised just 50 miles from where Blackroot once stood. But her DNA results didn't make sense. Her genetic code showed signs of homozygosity, identical sequences repeating where variation should be. The kind of genetic collapse scientists only see in royal dynasties from centuries past, or in sealed, interbreeding families. Her ancestry was untraceable beyond a single great-grandmother. Every record before that was missing, burned in courthouse fires, erased in census errors, or lost in floods. But the surnames that did appear matched those that once lived in Blackroot Hollow. They brought her back for more tests. That's when the professor, an old man with shaking hands, asked if she'd ever had nightmares. She said she had them every night, the same one since childhood. A girl standing in a doorway of firelight, whispering in a voice that wasn't hers. "Dig me up." Mary vanished 2 weeks later. Her car was found at the base of the ridge, near the overgrown trail that led to the ruins of the old cabin. The sheriff's search team found her backpack, her phone, her shoes. But not her. When they expanded the search area, they discovered the earth disturbed again. A wide patch of soil freshly turned, though no prints led to or from it. Beneath the dirt, they found bones, not one body, but many small, deformed, bound together in roots that had grown through their ribs. Tests revealed they were over a century old, but the final report was sealed. No cause of death, no official acknowledgement. Only the sheriff's note at the bottom of the file: "The soil here breathes." A month later, strange things began to happen in town. Birds flying into windows, wells turning cloudy, One man claimed he saw a pale figure standing on the road before dawn, barefoot, her dress the color of soot. By midsummer, someone painted words on the sheriff's office door, Sekis Bekin, T below OD. And then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. The air cleared. The nights grew still. The town forgot, or tried to, but stories like this never end. They just go quiet until someone new starts digging again. Because the horror of Blackroot was never the girl herself. It was the blood. That closed circle, that unbroken chain, turning in on itself again and again, until it found a way to survive. And when the wind moves through those trees tonight, you might hear it. A child's voice, thin and buried in the sound of leaves, whispering the same word she always did. Grandpa. E&D.